The auditorium lights were dim but warm, throwing soft gold across the polished wooden stage. The faint hum of conversation filled the hall as people shuffled into their seats, whispering and checking programs. It was the city's annual talent showcase, an event that drew everyone from school students to retired musicians hoping for one more moment in the spotlight. The audience was ready for surprises, laughter, and maybe a few tears. Backstage, a young girl stood alone beside a tall black piano. Her hands were clasped tightly together, fingers trembling a little. She could hear the muffled sounds of applause. From the act before hers, a lively group of dancers, and her heart raced faster with every clap. She tried to steady her breathing, but the thumping in her chest only grew louder. She had dreamed of this day for months, not because she wanted fame or a prize, but because it meant something personal, something she could hardly explain to anyone else. Her old piano teacher had told her once that every note played with honesty could touch a heart, and tonight she wanted to prove that true. Her name wasn't on any headlines yet. To the crowd, she was just another contestant, a shy teenager with too big sleeves and too small confidence. But to herself, this performance was everything. A stage assistant gave her a nod. "You're next." She swallowed hard, clutching her sheet music even though she had memorized every single bar. The paper felt like a safety net she couldn't let go of. She whispered a quiet prayer under her breath and stepped out toward the stage. As she walked into the light, the chatter in the crowd began to fade. Some people clapped politely, others looked down at their phones. Sitting in the front row were 3 judges. 2 smiled encouragingly, but the man in the middle didn't. He was famous, a concert pianist known across the country for his sharp wit and even sharper critiques. He had a reputation for saying things others wouldn't dare. Musicians feared him, but audiences loved his drama. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his expression half bored and half amused. When the girl reached the piano bench, he leaned toward his microphone and spoke. "You look nervous," he said, his tone carrying through the speakers. Some people chuckled. "Relax," he added with a crooked smile. "It's just music. We're not saving lives here." The girl smiled politely, not trusting her voice to respond. He gestured to the piano. "So, what are you going to play for us?" She cleared her throat. "A short piece I composed myself," she said softly. "Oh," he said, raising an eyebrow. "An original. That's brave." The way he said brave made a few people laugh again. "Let's hope it's worth the risk." She nodded, turned toward the piano, and adjusted the bench. Her heart pounded in her ears. She placed her fingers gently on the keys, but before she could start, the judge spoke again. "Posture, dear," he said. "Sit tall. A musician should always look confident, even if you're not." This time the laughter was louder. Her shoulders stiffened. She adjusted herself slightly, not because he told her to, but because she wanted to start and make it stop. The noise, the eyes, the waiting. She took one deep breath. The hall seemed suddenly much too big. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her. She closed hers for a second and remembered her teacher's voice. "Play the truth, not the notes." Then she pressed a single key. A soft, low sound filled the air. Just one note, but it rang through the hall with surprising clarity. There was something pure about it, like a whisper that carried far. The audience quieted a little, perhaps expecting her to continue, but she waited, letting the note fade completely before moving on. Her fingers began to move slowly, carefully. The melody was simple, almost fragile. It wasn't a flashy piece or a technical show. It was something personal, gentle, sad, and full of feeling. The judge who had laughed leaned forward slightly. The girl's hands moved gracefully, each note connecting to the next like footsteps through a quiet memory. The melody began to build, growing slightly stronger, the rhythm steadier. Her nerves began to fade as she lost herself in the sound. She no longer noticed the faces watching her or the bright lights above. She saw only the piano keys and the story they were telling, one she had carried for years, tucked away where no one could see it. Her mother used to sit beside her when she practiced at home, humming softly while folding laundry or stirring a pot in the kitchen. Those memories floated in the air as she played. There was love in every chord, sadness in every pause. The audience began to sense it, too. For the first time that evening, the restless whispers in the crowd disappeared. Even the smallest sounds, a cough, a shuffle of shoes, seemed out of place. The hall grew still. A few people in the audience exchanged glances, their expressions softening. Something about the way she played felt real, not trained or polished, but honest. It wasn't about perfection. It was about emotion. As the music continued, the girl leaned slightly into the keys, eyes half closed. Her fingers trembled but never faltered. She was pouring herself into every moment, and the piano responded like it understood. Halfway through the piece, she reached a section where the melody slowed and became quiet again, almost like it was speaking in half sentences. The judge, the same man who had teased her minutes ago, rested his chin on his hand. He didn't smile now. His eyes followed her fingers as they danced softly across the keys. It wasn't that the music was complicated. It was that it meant something. It carried something human, something that couldn't be faked. When she played the final passage, her touch was lighter, almost fragile. The sound rose, then fell like a sigh. She held the last note just long enough to make everyone feel it before letting it fade into silence. No one clapped. Not yet. For several long seconds, the hall was utterly still. The girl sat frozen, afraid to look up. She thought maybe she had failed, that the silence meant disapproval. Her heart pounded again, and she lowered her eyes, ready to stand and leave quietly. Then someone in the back began to clap softly. Another joined, then another. Within seconds, the room erupted into applause, not loud or chaotic, but heartfelt. People stood, some wiped their eyes. The sound filled the hall until she finally looked up. The judge in the middle was still seated, but his face had changed. The arrogance was gone. He looked humbled. Slowly, he began to clap too. The girl's lips parted slightly in surprise. She didn't smile, not yet. She simply looked at him, unsure of what to do. He leaned toward his microphone. That, he said quietly, was unexpected. The audience laughed, but this time it wasn't mocking. It was warm. He continued, "You have something rare. It's not about skill or experience. It's about sincerity. You played with honesty. That's what music is." The girl finally smiled, just a little. She nodded politely and whispered a thank you before leaving the stage. The applause followed her all the way backstage, echoing in her ears. Behind the curtain, she leaned against the wall, heart still racing. Her hands were shaking, not from nerves anymore, but from relief. She had done it. Not perfectly, but truthfully. A stage assistant came over, eyes shining. "That was beautiful," she said. "You made everyone stop breathing for a second." The girl laughed softly, her voice trembling. "I just wanted to play something real." And she had. Outside, in the audience, the famous judge sat back in silence long after the clapping ended. He didn't say much to the other judges. For once, he had nothing clever to add. He just stared at the piano where she had sat, lost in thought. Maybe it reminded him of why he started playing long ago, before the fame, before the ego, back when music still had meaning. The night went on. Other performers came and went, but no one forgot the quiet girl who had played that haunting melody. The air still felt different somehow, softer, calmer. People spoke in low voices during the intermission, mentioning her performance again and again. A man in the audience who had come just to support his nephew's comedy act said quietly, "That girl, she didn't play like she was trying to win. She played like she was remembering something." And that was exactly it. Later that night, when the results were announced, the girl didn't even wait for her name. She was sitting backstage, still processing everything that had happened. She didn't care about the prize or the ranking. What mattered to her was that she had been heard, really heard, for the first time. When her name was called as one of the finalists, she was too stunned to move. The stage assistant nudged her gently. "Go," she whispered. "That's you." The audience cheered again as she stepped back into the light. She smiled shyly, the kind of smile that said she still couldn't quite believe it. The same judge stood up as she approached the front of the stage. He took the microphone one last time. "Earlier tonight," he said, "I made a joke I shouldn't have. I forgot that real music isn't about impressing anyone. It's about feeling something. You reminded me." The crowd applauded again, but she just bowed her head slightly. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. When she finally walked out of the auditorium that night, the city air felt cool and new. She looked up at the dark sky and let out a deep breath she didn't realize she'd been holding all evening. Somewhere inside, she felt lighter. She didn't know that someone in the audience had recorded her entire performance on a phone. She didn't know that by morning, that video would start spreading online, shared again and again by people who said they couldn't stop listening. For now, she just walked quietly toward home, her fingers still tingling from the piano keys. Her heart calm. For the first time in weeks, she had played one note, and somehow, that one note had changed everything. The next morning began quietly. The girl woke up early not because of an alarm, but because her mind was still replaying the night before. The sound of applause echoed in her thoughts. Every time she closed her eyes, she could see the bright stage lights and the crowd rising to their feet. It didn't feel real yet. She sat by the window with a cup of tea, still in her pajamas, watching the soft sunlight spill over the street outside. The world looked the same as it did yesterday, yet somehow everything felt different. For months she had imagined how the performance would go. She had pictured herself trembling, maybe stumbling over a few notes and walking away unnoticed. She never imagined the room going quiet, the judge clapping or people crying in the audience. Her phone buzzed on the table. She didn't check it right away. She wasn't expecting any messages except maybe one from her teacher congratulating her. When she finally picked it up, her eyes widened. There were dozens of notifications, messages from classmates, teachers, even people she barely knew. At first, she thought maybe the local newspaper had mentioned her name or the event's website had posted results. But then she saw a message from a friend that made her sit up straighter. "You're going viral." She frowned, confused. Viral? That couldn't be right. She wasn't famous. She clicked the link her friend had sent. It led to a video on a social media platform, a recording of her performance from the night before. The title read, "Judge Mocks Teen Pianist," and then she plays this. The thumbnail showed her sitting at the piano, her eyes closed in concentration. The video already had thousands of views. The comment section was overflowing. Her hands trembled slightly as she scrolled through them. One comment read, "This made me cry. So pure." Another said, "The judge's face at 3:15 says it all." Someone else wrote, "She played from her soul. No fancy tricks, just emotion." She stared at the screen, stunned. More messages kept pouring in. People from other cities and even other countries were sharing the video. Her heart pounded as she watched herself play on the little screen. It felt strange, almost unreal, to see her own nervous movements captured from the audience's view. She could hear the same note that had silenced the room, that soft beginning that now seemed to echo through thousands of phones and computers around the world. She smiled faintly but didn't know what to do. She wasn't used to attention. She didn't post videos. She didn't even talk much in school. Now suddenly, strangers were calling her the girl who silenced a crowd. When her mother walked into the kitchen, still half asleep, she noticed the look on her daughter's face. "Everything okay?" she asked gently. The girl nodded, then hesitated. "I think people are watching my performance online." Her mother put on her glasses and leaned over to see the phone. "Oh my," she whispered after a moment. "That's you." She smiled, shaking her head. "I didn't even know someone was recording." Her mother hugged her. "You see? I told you your music could touch people." It was true. Her mother had always believed in her even when others didn't. There had been times when teachers told her to play faster, louder, more showy pieces to win competitions. But her mother always said, "Play how you feel, not how they expect." The next few days were a blur. The video spread everywhere. More people shared it, newspapers picked it up, and online channels started using it as an example of humility versus arrogance. Some praised her bravery. Others talked about the judge's change of expression. Reporters began reaching out for interviews. Some even came to her school asking for her. It was overwhelming. At first she wanted to hide. Fame, even in small doses, felt heavy. But then she remembered why she played in the first place. It wasn't for attention. It was to express something real. Maybe this was just another way her music could reach people. Not through fancy concerts, but through a moment of truth. Her piano teacher called that evening. His voice was full of warmth and pride. "I saw the video," he said. "That was the most heartfelt performance I've seen in years." "Thank you," she said quietly. "I was so nervous." "That's good," he replied with a chuckle. "Nervous means you cared. But you should also know, that judge, the one who teased you, he wasn't always like that. Years ago, he was known for playing with deep emotion just like you. Then fame changed him. Maybe you reminded him of what he lost." The girl listened silently. She hadn't thought about that before. "He might even thank you one day," her teacher added. She laughed softly. "I doubt it." But deep down, a part of her wondered. That night, she opened her laptop and searched for interviews of the judge. She found clips of him performing decades ago. In one of them, he played a classical piece with such intensity that she couldn't look away. He had once been young and passionate too, his face filled with emotion, his movements free. The man she saw on screen was nothing like the cold, sarcastic judge she met on stage. She realized something then. Maybe people don't stop caring about music. Maybe they just forget how to feel it. The next day, her school principal called her to the office. She walked in nervously, unsure if she was in trouble for all the attention. But the principal smiled kindly. "You've brought pride to our school," she said. "We've been getting calls from news stations. They want to feature your story." The girl blushed. "I'm not sure I'm good at interviews," she admitted. "Just be yourself," the principal said. "The world already likes that version of you." Later that week, she appeared on a small local news segment. The reporter asked gentle questions about how she felt on stage, what went through her mind when the judge laughed, and what she wanted to do next. "I just wanted to play something honest," she said simply. "Music isn't about being perfect. It's about saying something you can't say with words." That line was quoted everywhere afterward. People shared it online with pictures of her at the piano. Meanwhile, the judge remained silent. He hadn't made any public statements since the video went viral. Some people speculated that he was embarrassed. Others said he was avoiding interviews because he didn't want to admit he was wrong. But behind the scenes, something else was happening. A week after the performance, she received an email from an unknown sender. The subject line read, "An invitation." She hesitated before opening it. It was from the judge. The message was short, polite, and sincere. "I owe you an apology. I misjudged you before you even began. Your performance reminded me of what music truly means. I'd like to invite you to perform at my upcoming charity concert next month, as my guest. You don't have to accept, but I would be honored if you did." Her heart skipped a beat. She read the message again and again, unsure what to think. Part of her wanted to ignore it. Another part felt something close to forgiveness. She showed the email to her mother, who read it carefully and smiled softly. "People make mistakes," her mother said, "but not everyone admits them. Maybe this is his way of making peace." That night, she couldn't sleep. She thought about the stage, the lights, the moment of silence, and the face of the man who had mocked her. He had seemed so sure of himself, so untouchable, but maybe he had been hiding his own fears too. By morning, she had made her decision. She replied to the email with a short message. "Thank you for your kind words. I'd be happy to perform." The next few weeks passed quickly. She practiced every day after school, preparing something new for the concert. She didn't want to repeat the same piece. She wanted to create something that reflected how she had grown, still honest, still emotional, but with more confidence this time. Her teacher helped her refine it, reminding her to breathe, to trust the pauses, and to play from the heart. When the day of the charity concert arrived, the city theater was packed. Reporters were waiting outside, eager to see if the viral moment would repeat itself. The judge, and now her host, greeted her backstage. He looked different up close, calmer, almost humble. "I'm glad you came," he said quietly. She smiled. "Thank you for inviting me." He nodded, his expression sincere. "You reminded me why I started playing in the first place," he said. "I hope you never lose that feeling." She didn't know what to say, so she just smiled and bowed slightly. When it was her turn to perform, she stepped onto the stage once more. The lights were bright, the audience hushed. She took a deep breath, placed her fingers on the piano, and began to play. This time there was no laughter, no mockery, only respect. Her new piece began with a gentle melody, full of hope. It carried traces of her old song, but brighter, like sunlight breaking through clouds. Every note seemed to float and linger, reaching out to the hearts of those listening. The judge watched from the side of the stage, his eyes glistening. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. She stood, bowed deeply, and smiled at the audience. As she walked off stage, the judge met her with open arms. "That," he said softly, "was perfect." She shook her head. "It wasn't perfect," she replied. "It was honest." He laughed quietly. "Even better." That night, as they took a bow together, the crowd rose to its feet again. But this time it wasn't just for her. It was for what both of them had learned. Sometimes a single note can change a career. Other times it can change a person. And for them it had done both. The concert night faded into memory, but the feelings it left behind didn't. For weeks afterward, people still talked about the young girl who had turned silence into music, and the famous pianist who had rediscovered his humility. The video from that night spread too, showing them performing together, bowing side by side. It wasn't just a performance. It felt like a story about forgiveness and courage. The girl returned to her normal life after that. She went back to school, took her regular classes, and practiced the piano every evening just like before. Yet everything seemed slightly different now. Her classmates treated her differently, not in a bad way, but with quiet admiration. Even teachers who rarely spoke about music asked her how it felt to be on stage with someone so well known. She tried to stay humble through it all. She didn't think of herself as famous. To her, it was still about the sound of the keys under her fingers, the simple joy of turning emotion into melody. But she could feel that her life was slowly changing, even if she didn't plan for it to. One afternoon, while sitting in the music room at school, she found herself staring at the piano in front of her. The sun poured through the window, creating small golden shapes across the black and white keys. She touched one softly and let the note linger. Her teacher, who had walked in quietly behind her, said, "Still lost in that sound, aren't you?" She smiled. "I guess I am. It's strange. I keep thinking about that night and I wonder if it really happened." He laughed softly. "It did, and you handled it with more grace than most adults would." She shrugged. "It didn't feel like I did anything special. I just played." "That's exactly why it was special," he said. A few moments passed in silence before her teacher added, "You know, a talent like yours deserves a stage. Have you thought about auditioning for the National Youth Music Showcase? It's in a few months." She looked up, surprised. "The one in the Capitol?" He nodded. "It's a big opportunity. Only a handful of young musicians get selected each year. I think you should try." Her first instinct was to say no. Big cities, competitions, judges, and it all sounded intimidating. But then she remembered the first time she faced a crowd. She had been terrified then too, but that moment had changed everything. "I'll think about it," she said finally. That night at home, she mentioned it to her mother. Her mother smiled gently. "If it feels right, do it. But remember, don't do it for fame. Do it because you love to play." That simple advice stayed with her as she filled out the online form the next day. She recorded a short piece as part of the application. Something soft and emotional, like her previous performances, but with a few new ideas she had been experimenting with. A week later, an email arrived. "Congratulations. You have been selected to perform at the National Youth Music Showcase." Her heart leaped. She read the message 3 times just to be sure. She ran to tell her mother, who hugged her tightly, proud and teary-eyed. The showcase was 2 months away, and she practiced every day after school, refining her new composition. It wasn't just a song, it was a story told through sound. It began with hesitation, grew into confidence, and ended with peace. It reflected her own journey in a way that words couldn't capture, but as the date approached, nerves began to creep in again. This wasn't a small local audience. This was national. Professional musicians, producers, and critics would be there. What if they didn't like her music? What if they thought it was too simple? Her teacher noticed her anxiety during one lesson. "You're thinking too much again," he said kindly. "Remember what happened last time you stopped worrying and just played?" She smiled faintly. Everything went silent. "Exactly," he said. "Do that again." The night before the showcase, she could hardly sleep. She sat by her piano, fingers tracing the keys lightly in the dark. Her mother peeked in and said softly, "Get some rest, dear. You'll need your energy tomorrow." "I know," she whispered, "but I can't stop hearing the song in my head." Her mother chuckled. "Then that means you're ready." The next morning they traveled to the capital. The city was buzzing. Tall buildings, busy streets, endless noise. The performance hall was grand, much bigger than anything she had seen before. The walls shimmered under chandeliers, and rows of red velvet seats stretched far into the distance. Backstage, she met other young musicians. Some were tuning violins, some whispering vocal warm-ups, others pacing nervously. She smiled politely but kept mostly to herself. As she waited for her turn, she took a deep breath and tried to calm her shaking hands. Then she heard a familiar voice behind her. "You didn't tell me you were performing here." She turned around. It was the same pianist who had once laughed at her, the man who later invited her to his concert. He was one of the event's guest judges. "I didn't know you'd be here," she said shyly. He smiled warmly. "I'm glad I am. It feels right to see how far you've come." Something about his presence steadied her nerves. This time he wasn't an intimidating figure. He was more like an old friend who understood. When her name was announced, she stepped onto the grand stage. The hall was silent, expectant. She adjusted the bench, placed her fingers on the keys, and began to play. The melody started soft, gentle like a whisper. The notes floated upward, echoing through the hall's high ceiling. As she played, her nerves melted away. She could feel the story unfolding. The same story that had begun months ago when she faced laughter and turned it into silence. Her fingers moved with confidence now, touching each key like she was speaking directly to every person in the audience. The music rose and fell like a heartbeat. Calm, then powerful, then calm again. People leaned forward, mesmerized. Even the smallest child in the audience stayed still, eyes wide. The judges exchanged quiet glances. The pianist who once doubted her sat motionless, his expression soft and proud. When she reached the final section, the hall seemed to breathe with her. Each note shimmered and faded like ripples on water. She held the last note a little longer, letting it sink deep into the room. Then she lifted her hands gently and sat still. For a moment there was complete silence. Not the awkward kind, but the kind that feels sacred. Then the applause came, slow and building, until it filled every corner of the hall. Tears welled in her eyes as she stood and bowed. Backstage, the pianist met her again. "You've grown," he said softly. "That was extraordinary." She smiled through her tears. "Thank you for believing in me." He shook his head. "No," he said, smiling gently. "Thank you for reminding me to believe in music again." Later that evening, when the judges announced the results, she wasn't even thinking about winning. She was too overwhelmed by the experience itself, the silence, the connection, the emotion. But when they called her name as the winner of the showcase, the hall erupted once more. She stood frozen, disbelief washing over her. She walked forward slowly as people clapped, some even standing. The pianist handed her the award, a small golden treble clef mounted on wood, and whispered, "You've earned every bit of this." She smiled shyly and took it, bowing deeply to the audience. When she returned home days later, the small trophy sat quietly on her bedside table. She didn't look at it much. What stayed with her more was the memory, the feeling of being truly understood without speaking a word. Her mother noticed her staring at the piano that evening. "You look like you're thinking again," she said with a laugh. The girl smiled. "I'm just wondering what comes next." Her mother put a hand on her shoulder. "Whatever it is, just keep your heart the same. That's what people hear when you play." She nodded slowly. "I will." As the weeks went on, invitations began to arrive, small concerts, school events, interviews. But she chose carefully which ones to accept. She didn't want to lose what made her music special. Sometimes she performed in small community centers where the audiences were only a few dozen people. Other times she visited hospitals, playing quietly for patients who couldn't attend big concerts. Those were her favorite moments. The smiles, the tears, the stillness, and they meant more to her than any award ever could. One afternoon, after a performance at a children's ward, an elderly nurse came up to her and said, "You don't just play the piano. You speak to hearts." That sentence stayed with her for a long time. Months later, she was invited to perform again, not at a competition, but at a memorial concert honoring musicians who had passed. The pianist who had once mocked her was organizing it, and he personally asked her to close the event with a solo. When the night came, the hall was dimly lit, candles glowing softly along the aisles. The audience sat in quiet reflection. When she began to play, the music floated gently through the room, carrying warmth and peace. As the final note faded, people bowed their heads in silence, not out of sadness but out of gratitude. That night, she realized something profound. Music wasn't about applause or fame or perfection. It was about connection, invisible threads that tied one heart to another. She looked down at her hands, the same hands that once trembled on a small stage months ago, and smiled. She had come a long way, from a nervous girl being laughed at, to someone whose music now brought people together. And deep inside, she knew this was only the beginning of her journey. The sound of the piano filled the hall like a wave. It started soft and gentle, then grew deeper, flowing through every corner of the room. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The audience, who had been whispering and shifting in their seats just minutes ago, now sat perfectly still. Every eye was fixed on the girl at the piano. Her hands moved across the keys with such grace that it almost didn't seem real. There was no nervousness left in her body now. The fear that had once made her hands tremble was gone. Instead, there was only focus, pure and calm. Each note carried something more than sound. It carried feeling. It told a story that words could never express. The judge who had laughed at her earlier leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. His pen, which had been tapping impatiently against the table, now rested quietly in his hand. For the first time that evening, he wasn't thinking about his reputation or about being clever. He was simply listening. The music seemed to speak directly to the soul. It wasn't a showy performance full of fast runs or dramatic movements. It was something simple, honest, and full of heart. The kind of music that makes you remember things you thought you had forgotten, like a childhood memory, a loved one's voice, or a moment when life felt lighter. As she played, the lights above reflected gently off her hair. She looked peaceful, almost lost inside her own world. Her eyes were half closed, her head tilted slightly toward the keys, as if she could feel the sound before it came out. Every note was precise, yet full of warmth. Her fingers glided smoothly, but not because she was trying to impress anyone. It was because she understood the piano in a way that went beyond skill. She played as if the instrument was part of her, as if it understood her silence, her pain, and her joy. The melody rose higher, and people began to feel something inside them stir. A woman in the second row, who had been scrolling through her phone earlier, now held it still, her eyes glistening. A little boy in the front leaned forward, completely fascinated, his mouth slightly open. Even the stage lights seemed softer, as if they too were listening. At the side of the stage, the show host stood frozen. He had seen hundreds of performances before, but never one that made the air feel so heavy and light at the same time. It was as if every sound the girl created was painting the room with invisible colors, colors that only the heart could see. The judge finally put his pen down. His hand covered his mouth as he watched her. The smirk he once had was gone. For the first time in a long while, he didn't have anything clever to say. He felt small, humbled even. He thought about how quick he had been to laugh at her, to assume she had nothing to offer. He had seen hundreds of performers, but none like this. There was no fame in her eyes, no hunger for applause. She simply wanted to be heard. And in that moment she was, by everyone. As the piece continued, the hall grew quieter still. The air felt alive, charged with emotion. The sound of her playing had changed from soft and fragile to powerful and deep. Her right hand moved faster now, while her left added weight and soul. The notes collided like waves, then fell apart into soft ripples. No one could explain what they were feeling. Some people felt joy, others sadness, but all of them knew that they were witnessing something rare, something honest. The judge blinked a few times, trying to steady himself. He didn't expect to be moved. He had always believed that only technique mattered, that only those who could play fast and perfectly were worth admiration. But this performance wasn't about speed or perfection. It was about truth. And truth, he realized, had a sound. The girl didn't look at the audience once. She wasn't trying to read their faces or guess what they thought. Her focus never broke. She played as if she was speaking to someone far away, someone who needed to hear her message through the notes. Every touch on the piano keys carried emotion. Every pause meant something. A man in the back row wiped his eyes. He didn't even know why. The melody reminded him of his late wife, of quiet evenings when she used to hum old songs. Another woman clasped her hands tightly, feeling a warmth rise inside her chest. It wasn't sadness. It was something more like healing. The girl's expression changed slightly as she moved toward the final part of the piece. Her eyebrows drew closer together. The music deepened, turning almost sorrowful, but beautiful at the same time. It sounded like a memory fading, like someone saying goodbye without words. A few of the judges exchanged glances as if silently agreeing that they were witnessing something they wouldn't forget. The host took a slow breath. Even the camera crew moved carefully, trying not to make a single noise that might break the moment. Then came a soft transition. The girl lifted her hands for a brief second and the room held its breath. That silence, the kind that only comes once in a lifetime, filled the hall. Then, gently, she pressed the keys again. The sound was like a whisper, barely there but powerful enough to make the entire audience feel it. Her fingers danced delicately, as if she was painting emotion into the air. The melody returned to the gentle tone it had started with, bringing the story full circle. The sound felt like forgiveness, like acceptance. The judge swallowed hard. He had seen prodigies, winners, and professionals. But this girl, this quiet young pianist, had something they didn't. She wasn't just playing music. She was sharing a piece of her soul. The notes became slower now, more fragile, each one fading a little longer than the last. People leaned forward instinctively, afraid to miss even a single sound. The air felt thick, charged with emotion that no one could put into words. The judge could feel his heartbeat slow down, matching the rhythm of her final notes. It was strange. He didn't want it to end. As she reached the last line of the piece, she closed her eyes completely. The room stayed utterly silent. She pressed the final chord with both hands. It was soft, almost like a sigh. The sound lingered in the air, drifting, echoing, and then slowly disappearing. When the music stopped, she didn't move. Her hands stayed on the keys. Her head remained bowed. For a few seconds, it felt like no one dared to breathe. The silence that followed was heavy, but peaceful. It was the kind of silence that happens when something touches your soul so deeply that words feel useless. The girl slowly lifted her hands from the piano. Her shoulders rose and fell as she took a quiet breath. She didn't look up right away. She just sat there, still and calm, letting the silence speak. And then, something remarkable happened. The judge who had laughed at her earlier began to clap. Just once at first, slowly, softly. Then again. His expression had changed completely. There was no trace of pride left on his face, only respect. The rest of the audience joined in, their clapping building like a wave. Within moments, the entire hall was standing. The applause was thunderous. People were cheering, some crying, others simply standing there, stunned. But even in that loudness, the girl didn't smile right away. She looked up at the audience, her eyes shining, not with pride, but with gratitude. She bowed her head slightly, almost shyly, as if she still couldn't believe what had just happened. The judge stood up too, unable to hide the emotion on his face. He mouthed something. Maybe, "Thank you," or maybe, "I was wrong." No one could tell, but it didn't matter. The moment spoke for itself. The girl finally stood, her hands clasped in front of her. She gave one last small bow and walked quietly off the stage. The applause followed her all the way out. Backstage, the host met her with wide eyes and a trembling voice. He didn't even know what to say. "That was," he began, but stopped. No words seemed right. She simply smiled and said, "I just played what I felt." He nodded, still overwhelmed. Everyone backstage was quiet for a while, as if they were afraid to break the spell of what had just happened. In that moment, the girl didn't need to win or prove anything. She had already done something greater. She had changed the way people listened, the way they felt. The laughter that had greeted her in the beginning was long gone, replaced by awe and silence. It was the kind of silence that only comes when the truth has been heard. The applause seemed endless. It rolled through the hall like thunder, echoing off the walls. People were on their feet, clapping until their hands stung. Some shouted her name. Others simply stood there overwhelmed, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. But in the middle of all that noise, the girl stood quietly near the piano, her eyes lowered, her expression calm. She didn't rush to smile or wave. She just let the moment breathe. It was as if she understood that what had just happened wasn't just about her performance. It was about something deeper, something that reached into everyone's heart and pulled out something they hadn't felt in a long time. The judge, who had mocked her earlier, remained standing, his hands still moving, his face strangely soft. He had spent years judging performances, giving quick opinions, scoring based on technical perfection. But now he felt something he couldn't score, a quiet ache, a sense of humility that filled him from within. When the applause finally began to fade, the host walked onto the stage, his steps slow, his eyes still wide. He looked at the girl as if he was seeing her for the first time. The microphone trembled slightly in his hand. He smiled awkwardly and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we just witnessed something extraordinary." The audience cheered, again, not as loudly as before, but with the kind of warmth that made the room feel alive. The girl looked up, her cheeks flushed, and gave a small nod. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The host turned to the judges' table. "Would any of the judges like to share their thoughts?" he asked, though everyone already knew which judge the crowd wanted to hear from. The once arrogant judge hesitated before standing. He took the microphone slowly, his eyes still on her. There was a heavy silence as he cleared his throat. For a moment he looked like he was searching for words, something he wasn't used to doing. He finally said, in a quiet voice, "I was wrong." The audience hushed. He looked down for a second, then back at the girl. "When you came on stage, I judged you before you played a single note. I thought I already knew how it would go, but you reminded me that real talent isn't about confidence or perfection. It's about truth. You played with more honesty and emotion than most people do in a lifetime." The hall was silent again, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was full of respect. The judge continued softly, "That one note you started with, it changed everything. You made this entire room listen. You made me listen." The crowd began to clap again, this time slowly, deeply, like a heartbeat. The girl blinked, holding back tears. She nodded once, then whispered something into the microphone so quietly that the audience had to lean in to hear. She said, "Music isn't about being perfect. It's about feeling." That simple sentence made the audience cheer again. It wasn't just applause this time. It was connection. When she walked off the stage, the crew members backstage greeted her with quiet smiles. One of them handed her a small bottle of water, and another whispered, "That was beautiful." She thanked them softly and sat on a nearby chair. Her heart was still beating fast. She could hear the sound of the audience from behind the curtain, still clapping, still talking about her performance. She pressed her hands together and closed her eyes for a moment. It wasn't pride she felt, it was relief. Relief that she hadn't let fear win. Relief that her music had reached people the way she hoped it would. The host came backstage after the show ended. His voice was full of excitement. "You're going to want to see this," he said, holding up his phone. Someone had already posted a short clip of her performance online, and it was spreading fast. Comments were flooding in from people who said they'd been moved to tears even though they didn't know her name. She looked at the screen in disbelief. "Already?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Already? You did something special out there. But she didn't smile with the kind of excitement most people would have. Instead, she simply looked thoughtful. "I didn't do it for views," she said quietly. "I just wanted to play." He nodded again, this time more respectfully. And that's exactly why it worked. Meanwhile, outside the hall, people were still talking about her. Some said they'd never felt so emotional during a performance. Others said they wanted to learn piano after hearing her play. A few even said that one moment had reminded them of something important they had forgotten, to believe in quiet strength. The judge walked out the back door of the hall later that night, but he didn't go straight to his car. He stopped for a moment, looking up at the sky. He had spent years thinking he knew everything about music, about talent. But tonight, a quiet teenage girl had taught him something new, something he couldn't learn from books or fame. He realized how often people confuse confidence with ability, noise with meaning. He promised himself that from now on, he would listen before he spoke. Back in the green room, the girl sat alone for a few minutes trying to process what had just happened. Her fingers still tingled from the piano keys. Her heart still echoed with the sound of that final note. She thought about how close she had come to walking off the stage before playing, how that one moment of courage had changed everything. She looked down at her hands and smiled faintly. "Just one note," she whispered to herself. That's all it took. Later that night, when she returned home, her family was waiting for her. They didn't say much at first, they just hugged her tightly. Her mother had tears in her eyes, and her father kept shaking his head as if he couldn't believe what he had seen. "You made the whole world listen," her father said softly. She smiled shyly. "I just played," she replied. Her little brother ran to her, holding a drawing he had made of a piano and a big audience. "You were amazing," he said proudly. She laughed and ruffled his hair. The next morning, her phone was full of notifications. The video had gone viral overnight. People from all over the world were sharing it. Some said the performance gave them goosebumps. Others said it helped them through a hard moment. Messages poured in. Students, parents, musicians, strangers, all saying the same thing. Her music had made them feel something real. She read some of the comments and felt her heart swell. Not because of the praise, but because she realized that her story had touched people who had never even met her. The same judge who had laughed at her posted on his social media too. His post read, "Last night I laughed at someone I should have listened to. I was taught a lesson by a young pianist who reminded me what real music means. It's not about perfection, it's about emotion. I'm grateful to have been proven wrong." People praised him for admitting his mistake, but he didn't care about that. He just wanted to make it right. He reached out to her privately and invited her to perform at a charity concert he was organizing the next month. At first, she hesitated. "I'm not sure I'm ready for something that big," she said. But he told her, "You were ready the moment you played that first note." So she agreed. The day of the concert arrived quickly. The hall was even bigger this time, filled with people from across the city. Cameras, lights, reporters, everything was larger and louder. But she didn't let it overwhelm her. She walked onto the stage with the same calmness she had before. The judge introduced her himself. His voice carried warmth this time. "Sometimes," he said to the crowd, "the most powerful sound in the world isn't a loud one. It's a single note played with truth." The audience applauded as she took her seat at the piano again. This time she wasn't nervous. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She was simply there to share. When she began to play, the sound spread through the hall just like before. Soft, emotional, real. And once again, the crowd grew silent, lost in the moment. The judge watched from the side, smiling quietly. He knew she didn't need his approval anymore. She had found her own voice. When she finished, the crowd stood once more. The applause was long and heartfelt, but she didn't cry this time. She just smiled, peaceful, sure, and thankful. Later that night, the judge approached her backstage. "Thank you," he said. She looked up at him, confused. "For what?" "For reminding me what it means to really listen." She smiled gently. "Music can do that," she said. He nodded. "Yes, but only when it comes from someone who plays with their heart." They shook hands quietly. No big speeches, no staged moments. Just two people who understood something about each other now. When she walked out of the hall that night, the air felt different. The stars above seemed brighter, and the city noises seemed softer. She took a deep breath, feeling the cool wind on her face. Somewhere behind her, the sound of a piano still echoed faintly in her mind. That night, as she lay in bed, she thought about how much had changed since that first day. How fear had turned into strength. How laughter had turned into silence, and how silence had turned into applause. She smiled to herself before closing her eyes. All it takes, she whispered, is one honest note. And with that, she drifted off to sleep, peaceful, proud, and ready for whatever came next. The next morning, she woke up to the sound of her phone buzzing nonstop. The sun had barely risen, but her notifications were endless. Messages, calls, and emails poured in from everywhere. People she didn't know, reporters, teachers, musicians, even strangers from other countries. At first, she thought it was some kind of mistake. She rubbed her eyes, checked her phone again, and there it was. Her performance had gone viral across the world. The video wasn't just trending. It was everywhere. News channels were replaying it, headlines were being written, and her name had become a topic of conversation in households she had never even heard of. Her mother came into the room, her eyes filled with disbelief. "You're on the news," she said softly, holding her phone up. The girl blinked in surprise. On the screen, a news anchor was talking about her story. The headline read, "A teen pianist silences a room and teaches a judge a lesson in humility." Clips of her performance were being shown, the single note echoing across the speakers. The anchor's voice said, "What began as an ordinary talent show ended with one of the most emotional performances ever witnessed." The girl didn't know how to react. She just sat there quiet, holding her phone tightly as messages kept flooding in. Some people thanked her for inspiring them. Others shared stories of how they had been laughed at but never gave up. She scrolled through hundreds of comments, reading every single word slowly as if trying to understand how something so personal had reached so many hearts. Her father walked in and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You see?" he said with a smile. "The world needed to hear you." She looked up, still unsure how to process it all. "I didn't expect this," she said. "I just wanted to play." "That's why it worked," her father replied. "Because it came from your heart." Later that day, she was invited to several interviews. People wanted to hear her story, to understand what made her performance so powerful. But in every interview, she spoke humbly. She didn't talk about fame or success. She talked about fear, about how close she was to walking away, and about how sometimes one honest moment can change everything. One interviewer asked her, "What were you thinking when you played that first note?" She smiled softly. "I was thinking that if I didn't play from my heart, the music wouldn't mean anything. I just wanted to make people feel something real." Her words spread just as quickly as her music had. People shared short clips of her interviews, quoting her simple but powerful message. "Play from your heart," they wrote under her photos. Meanwhile, the judge who had once mocked her began to receive messages too. Some criticized him, others thanked him for admitting he was wrong. But he didn't shy away from it. He openly said in one interview, "That young pianist reminded me of what I had forgotten, the soul of music. I owe her my respect." He even shared the video himself with the caption, "This is what real talent looks like. Not perfection, but truth." It wasn't long before she received an invitation that changed her life once again. A famous orchestra from another country had seen her video and wanted her to perform as a guest pianist at their upcoming concert. When she read the email, she froze. She had dreamed of performing with an orchestra since she was a little girl, but she never thought it would happen this way. Her mother held her hand, smiling through tears. "You should go," she said softly. "You earned this." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Reporters followed her story closely. Music teachers began using her performance as an example in classrooms. Children wrote her letters saying they wanted to learn piano because of her. Even schools reached out to invite her to speak about perseverance and courage. But through it all, she stayed grounded. She still practiced every day in the same small room, on the same piano she had always used. She still helped her little brother with his homework and washed the dishes with her mother. She didn't let fame change the quiet simplicity of her life. The night before the big orchestra concert, she sat alone by her piano. The lights in the house were off except for a small lamp. She touched the keys gently, playing the same melody she had played at the talent show. The sound filled the room softly, wrapping around her like a warm blanket. She closed her eyes and smiled. It didn't matter how big the audience was or how many people watched online. What mattered was the same thing that mattered the first time, playing from the heart. The next evening, the concert hall was packed. It was larger than anything she had ever seen. The orchestra members tuned their instruments and the air buzzed with excitement. Cameras from all over the world were set up, ready to broadcast the performance live. When she walked onto the stage, the audience rose to their feet. The applause was overwhelming, but she stayed calm. She bowed slightly, her eyes kind and steady, then sat down at the piano. The conductor nodded to her, and the hall grew silent. Then she began to play. The first note rang out, pure and clear, just like before, and once again something magical happened. The world outside that hall disappeared. People listening online said they felt chills run through their bodies. Those in the audience said it felt like time had stopped. Her music carried the same message it always had, that emotions matter more than perfection, and that courage often comes from the quietest hearts. Halfway through the performance, the orchestra joined in. The strings swelled, the horns rose softly, and her piano wove through them all like sunlight on water. The sound was breathtaking. Some in the crowd closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. The judge who had once laughed at her was in the audience that night. He had flown across the country just to be there. As he watched her play, he felt tears forming in his eyes again. He realized how lucky he was to have witnessed her journey from the beginning, the moment she turned his laughter into silence, and silence into music. When the final note faded, the entire hall erupted in applause. But this time it wasn't just applause, it was gratitude. People stood for several minutes, clapping, shouting her name, cheering for her not as a star, but as someone who had reminded them of something deeply human. She stood, bowed humbly, and smiled through tears. The conductor placed a hand on her shoulder, and the orchestra members clapped for her too. After the concert, she walked outside into the cool night air. Fans waited with flowers, posters, and messages of love. She took pictures, signed a few programs, and thanked each person sincerely. One young girl approached her shyly, holding a small toy piano. "I want to play like you one day," she said softly. The pianist knelt down, smiling warmly. "Then play with your heart," she said. "Don't worry about being perfect. Just play what you feel." The little girl nodded, her eyes shining. Later that night, as she sat in her hotel room, she opened her laptop and saw the performance spreading again. Millions of new views, thousands of new comments. But instead of excitement, she felt peace. She realized the music wasn't hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who had listened, felt, and understood. Weeks passed, and her story continued to inspire. People around the world began sharing their own one-note moments, times when they had faced doubt but chose to believe in themselves. Her performance became more than just a viral video. It became a symbol of quiet strength and authenticity. She was invited to perform on television shows, at schools, and even at charity events. But wherever she went, she carried the same small piano charm on her necklace, a reminder of where it all began. One afternoon, she returned to the old hall where everything started. It was empty now, quiet except for the faint sound of air through the vents. She walked up to the same stage, ran her fingers along the same piano, and smiled. She sat down and pressed one key, just one note. It echoed softly, filling the empty space. That single sound brought back every memory. The laughter, the fear, the silence, the applause. She let it fade and whispered to herself, "It all started with this." A moment later, the door behind her creaked open. It was the judge. He had come quietly, not wanting to interrupt. He stood for a second, watching her, then said, "You still sound the same." She turned and smiled. "That's because the piano never forgets," he chuckled softly. "Neither do we." They stood there for a moment, both silent, both remembering how everything had changed from that single night. Then he said, "You know, people still talk about that note." She looked back at the piano and said, "That's all it ever was, a note. But it meant something," he nodded slowly. "It meant everything." When she left the hall that day, she didn't feel like a celebrity or a success story. She just felt thankful that she had followed her heart when it would have been easier to walk away. Years later, when people spoke about her, they didn't just talk about the viral video or her fame. They talked about how she made them feel, how she reminded them that even a single moment of honesty can change everything. And somewhere in a quiet home, a little girl practiced on her toy piano, pressing one key softly and smiling, because she knew that even one note, if played with heart, could touch the world. The pianist never stopped playing, but every time she sat at the piano, she remembered that night, the laughter, the silence, the stillness, and the one note that changed her life forever. And that's how her story lived on, not as a story about fame or revenge, but as a story about truth, courage, and the sound of one honest note that made the world stop and listen.